In the shadowed recesses of a forsaken attic, where the air hung heavy with the rot of forgotten sins, Alice Martinez unearthed a relic that whispered promises of eternal torment. The box was ancient, its wood warped by centuries of malice, and within it lay a deck of cards, 39 in number, each bearing a highly refined surface texture that gleamed like polished bone under the flickering candlelight. She, a desperate gambler fleeing the debts of a ruined life, had sought refuge in this crumbling estate inherited from a distant uncle whose name evoked only dread in whispered tales. The cards called to her, their edges sharp as surgical blades, inscribing faint crimson lines upon her fingertips as she shuffled them. Alice's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm echoing the distant thunder outside as if the storm itself conspired with the artifact. She dealt the first hand alone, the figures upon the cards twisting in unnatural contortions, limbs elongated, flesh peeled back to reveal glistening sinews and pulsing organs. A low purr interrupted her trance. A sleek black cat, its eyes twin voids of obsidian, slinked from the shadows, brushing against her leg with a fur that felt like velvet over thorns. It watched her with an intelligence that unnerved as if it knew the game's infernal stakes. As the cards revealed their secrets, Alice's vision blurred, the room warping into a labyrinth of flesh and bone. The attic walls pulsed, veined with arteries that throbbed in sync with her own. She drew the ace of agonies, and pain bloomed in her abdomen, a coiling serpent of fire that made her gasp. The cat leaped onto the table, its paws smearing blood from an unseen wound, and batted at a card depicting a flayed figure whose screams she could almost hear. "What have I unleashed?" she murmured, but the words dissolved into a gurgle as her skin began to itch, then split, revealing raw muscle beneath. 200 words into this descent, and the game escalated. The 39 cards multiplied in her mind's eye, each a portal to visceral horrors. Alice's fingers elongated, joints cracking like brittle twigs, as the gambler's luck turned to curse. The cat, now her silent sentinel, arched its back and hissed at invisible spectres crowding the air, ghosts of previous players, their forms mangled in trails dangling like macabre garlands. She tried to flee, but the door sealed with a membranous growth, slick and warm to the touch. Blood seeped from the walls, pooling around her feet, and in its reflection, she saw her face distorting, eyes multiplying into compound horrors. The plot surged forward, as the feline companion clawed at the cards, scattering them. One embedded in Alice's palm, fusing with her flesh in a symphony of agony. Visions assaulted her, cities of living meat, where inhabitants writhed in eternal ecstasy of pain, their bodies sculpted into grotesque architectures. She screamed, her voice joining a chorus from the deck, as the cat's form shifted subtly, fur parting to reveal scales beneath. The gambler's folly had awakened an ancient entity, bound in 39 facets of torment, and now it hungered for her essence. Deeper into the night, the estate groaned, foundations cracking as if the earth itself recoiled from the abomination unfolding within. Alice's body betrayed her further, bones splintering and reforming, a splatter of gore painting the attic in Pollock-esque patterns of red and ruin. The cat, loyal yet ominous, licked at the wounds, its tongue barbed, drawing more blood to fuel the ritual. She realized too late the game was not to win but to become the prize, her highly refined surface texture of skin sloughing away to expose the raw, quivering truth beneath. The cat's tongue rasped across the wound in Alice Martinez's palm, like a file dragged over raw nerve, each lick peeling back another layer of her dwindling sanity. The blood it tasted was no longer merely hers. It carried the copper tang of older sacrifices, layered and congealed across decades, perhaps centuries. 39 cards lay scattered across the attic floorboards now, yet they refused to lie flat. They curled at the edges as though breathing, the highly refined surface texture catching the candle's guttering flame and throwing back reflections of things that should never have worn human shape. Alice staggered backward until her spine met the wall. The plaster felt alive beneath her shoulder blades, warm, slightly yielding, as though the house itself were sweating in anticipation. A wet crack sounded from somewhere below the floor. The joists flexed and groaned as if great weights were shifting in the dark crawl space. The black cat patted a slow circle around her feet, tail high, the tip twitching in metronomic delight. Its eyes no longer reflected light. Instead, they drank it, twin holes that pulled at the candle flame until the wick bent toward them. She tried to speak the gambler's prayer she had once muttered in neon. Lit back rooms, one more hand, just one more, but her tongue had thickened. It pressed against the roof of her mouth, tasting of iron and spoiled meat, when she forced words out. They emerged as a wet rasp. "I didn't ask for this." The cat paused, head cocked, then answered in a voice that was not a voice. A vibration that rose through the soles of her feet, traveled the marrow of her legs, and settled behind her eyes. You dealt 200 words deeper into the night. The transformation accelerated. Alice's left forearm split along the inner seam from wrist to elbow. The skin parted with the soft sound of wet silk tearing. Beneath it lay not muscle but a glistening lattice of tendon and cartilage arranged in impossible symmetry, like the ribs of some vast, upturned hand. She stared at the exposed architecture of herself, and felt no pain, only a cold, ecstatic curiosity. The cards responded. One by one they lifted from the boards, suspended on threads of crimson mist, and began to orbit her. Each rotation brought a fresh incision, a hairline cut across her cheekbone, a long shallow channel down her thigh, a perfect circle carved around her left nipple. Blood welled in beads, then rose into the air, drawn toward the drifting deck as though gravity had reversed its allegiance. The cat leaped onto a rafter, overhead. Its silhouette stretched unnaturally, limbs elongating until it resembled a starved spider clothed in fur. From that perch it watched as the first true metamorphosis took hold. Alice's ribcage cracked outward. The bones did not break but unfolded, fanning like the petals of a grotesque flower. Between them lungs glistened wetly, inflating and deflating with a rhythm that matched the pulse of the house itself. She could see her own heart now, small, furious, wrapped in a net of veins that throbbed blue-black. It beat too fast, too loud, drowning every other sound until the entire attic seemed to drum in time with it. She reached for the nearest card, the Queen of Ruptures, and her fingers closed around it. The card did not resist. Instead, it sank into her palm, merging flesh and pasteboard in a single molten instant. Pain arrived then, bright and absolute, but it carried its own terrible beauty, the sensation of every nerve ending singing in unison, a choir of agony that promised, if only she would listen, a higher order of existence. The cat dropped silently to the floor again, landing between splayed ribs and exposed viscera. It sat, prim and expectant, as though waiting for her to deal the next hand from the red cathedral her body had become. Outside, the storm had ceased. In its place rose a silence so profound that Alice could hear the soft drip of her own blood striking the boards, each drop a metronome counting toward the moment when 39 would become 1. The heart that now hung exposed between the unfolded petals of Alice Martinez's ribs beat with a new obscene cadence, not the frantic tattoo of fear, but the slow, deliberate throb of something ancient waking inside borrowed meat. Each contraction sent ripples through the glistening latticework of her open torso, and the 39 cards, still orbiting in lazy crimson spirals, answered with sympathetic pulses of their own. They no longer resembled pasteboard. Their edges had softened, grown membranous, veined with the same blue-black tracery that webbed her lungs. The black cat, no longer content to observe, stepped forward onto the glistening floor of her abdominal cavity. Its paws left no prints in the pooling blood. Instead, the liquid parted and closed around them like obedient lips. When it settled between the pulsing bellows of her lungs, it began to knead, claws pricking the delicate tissue just enough to draw beads of bright arterial red. The pain was exquisite, surgical, almost courteous. Alice felt it travel upward along strange new pathways, mapping nerves that had not existed moments before. She tried to close her rib cage, to shield the vulnerable machinery within, but the bones only flexed farther outward, creaking like the ribs of a ship under full sail in a storm of flesh. A laugh escaped her, wet bubbling because the sensation was no longer entirely hers. Something else rode the current of her nerves, tasting her terror the way the cat had tasted her blood. 200 words into this new anatomy, the house itself joined the sacrament. The attic floorboards buckled upward in a slow peristaltic wave. Nails popped free and skittered across the boards like black beetles fleeing light. From the widening gaps between planks rose tendrils of pale, translucent meat, each tipped with a rudimentary eye that blinked in perfect synchrony with Alice's own multiplied pupils. The tendrils quested blindly until they found the drifting cards. Then they wrapped them gentle as lovers and drew them downward into the dark between the joists. One card, the Jack of Excoriations, resisted. It spun free of the grasping filaments and slapped wetly against Alice's sternum, just above the beating prize of her heart. The impact was not violent, it was intimate. The card melted into her skin the way candle wax melts, into warm flesh, leaving behind a perfect rectangular window of transparency. Through it, she could see the chambers of her heart working, the valves opening and closing with mechanical grace, each systole squirting a fine red mist that drifted upward to nourish the orbiting remnants of the deck. The cat lifted its head from between her lungs and regarded the new window with what might have been approval. Then it opened its own mouth, far wider than anatomy permitted, and exhaled. The breath was not air but a fine black vapor threaded with silver motes. The vapor coiled around the transparent pane, etching delicate script across the surface of her heart itself. 39 looping sigils, each one the name of a previous player who had sat at this same table and lost more than money. Alice read the names and knew them, not as words but as memories stolen from their final moments. She felt the snap of a woman's spine as her back was peeled like wet parchment, tasted the iron flood when a man's tongue was drawn out through the slit beneath his jaw, heard the soft, ecstatic sigh of another whose every orifice flowered open in simultaneous rupture. The memories nested inside her own mind like bright, terrible parasites. She reached down, fingers now articulated in 7 joints apiece, and lifted the cat until its face was level with her own. Its breath smelled of copper and old incense. "You were never just a cat," she whispered, voice layered with a dozen other dying voices. The creature blinked once, slowly. When its eyes opened again, the obsidian pupils had fractured into 39 glittering facets. Outside the sealed attic, the night pressed against the windows like a second, hungrier skin. Inside, Alice's body continued its patient unfolding, offering more of itself to the game that had already claimed her name. The cards, half submerged in the meat beneath the floor, began to hum, a low, wet note that vibrated through every exposed nerve and promised the next hand would be played with pieces far more intimate than flesh. The sigils carved upon the translucent window of Alice Martinez's heart pulsed once, twice, in perfect unison with the fractured facets of the cat's eyes. Each beat sent a fresh gout of arterial mist, spiraling upward to feed the remaining cards, now half submerged in the quivering floorboards like teeth, rooted in wet gum. The black vapor exhaled by the creature had thickened into cords. They looped around her unfurled ribs and drew them wider still, until the gap between bone and bone yawned like the split belly of a gutted fish left too long in the sun. Alice no longer stood. Her legs had buckled inward at impossible angles, femurs telescoping into themselves with wet, grinding sounds until her pelvis rested directly upon the boards. From that collapsed posture she watched, through the multiplying lenses of her own pupils, as the house completed its own slow evisceration. Ceiling beams split lengthwise, pale, corded muscles spilled downward in glistening ropes that brushed her cheeks and left warm trails of saliva, scented fluid. The attic smelled now of copper pennies heated over open flame, of marrow freshly cracked, of sex performed inside open wounds. The cat, its form no longer pretending at domesticity, stretched itself along the length of her exposed spine. Fur sloughed away in sheets, revealing obsidian scales beneath, each one etched with the same looping script that branded her heart. It coiled once around her throat, not choking but claiming, the tip of its tail slipping between her lips to rest upon her tongue like a sacrament. The taste was bitter iron and old myrrh. Swallowing was involuntary, inevitable. 200 words deeper into the liturgy of ruin, the 39 cards rose again. They no longer orbited, they nested. One after another, they pressed themselves into the raw surfaces of her body, into the scooped hollow beneath her breastbone, into the parted lips of her split abdomen, into the weeping sockets where new eyes had begun to sprout along her forearms. Each insertion was accompanied by a soft, sucking pop, followed by the sensation of roots threading through muscle and finding purchase in bone. The cards did not disappear, they became windows. Through every new pane, Alice glimpsed fragments of other lives terminated at this same table. A gambler whose fingers had been replaced with living flukes that burrowed inward. Another whose tongue had grown backward down the throat until it emerged from the navel as a second, whispering mouth. She understood then that the deck had never been 39 separate fates. It was one fate, refracted. 39 mirrors held up to the same devouring face. And now that face wore her features, the cat tightened its coil until breathing became a conscious act of will. Its scaled flanks pressed against the transparent pane over her heart. Through the contact she felt the organ stutter, then settle into a new, slower rhythm, one that matched the drip of blood from the ceiling, the flecks of the meat tendrils beneath the floor, the distant, wet thunder of something enormous turning over in the foundations of the estate. A single card remained unclaimed, hovering just beyond her reach, the 39th blank on both sides, yet somehow the heaviest presence in the room. It waited, patient as a held breath. Alice lifted one 7-jointed hand. The motion tore fresh rents along her shoulder, muscle parted in neat, surgical lines, exposing tendon that shimmered like wet violin string. She closed her fingers around the card. The instant of contact was apocalyptic in miniature. Light, sickly yellow, the color of old bruises, exploded outward from every embedded window at once. Her body convulsed, ribs snapping back toward midline only to flare outward again in a single, ecstatic spasm. Blood sprayed in high arcs, painting the walls in looping calligraphy that mirrored the sigils on her heart. Through the blinding flare, she saw the cat's form finally abandon pretense, limbs multiplying, torso elongating into a serpentine column crowned with her own face, mouth stretched in a rictus that was both grin and wound. When the light dimmed, the attic was changed. The walls no longer pretended at plaster. They breathed, rose and fell in slow bellows motion. The floor had become a shallow pool of her own vital fluids, rippling with each heartbeat. And Alice still, recognizably Alice, yet no longer merely Alice, sat at the center of it all, the final card fused flush against her sternum like a scarlet brand. The creature that had worn the shape of a cat lowered its many-jawed head until their foreheads touched. Its voice emerged not from any mouth, but from every pore of her altered flesh at once. "One hand remains," it said, "and the table is set for two." Outside the windows, the night had thickened into something that pressed back, hungry and expectant, as the estate prepared to deal the last of its long-hoarded cruelties. The creature that wore Alice Martinez's face at its crown leaned closer until their breaths mingled in the same wet cavern of air. Its multiplied jaws parted in sequence, each revealing rows of teeth that gleamed not white but the dull red of fresh scar tissue. From the deepest throat came a voice composed of every scream that had ever stained these walls. "The table is set for two, yet only one seat remains occupied." Deal. Alice's hand 7, jointed trembling with the borrowed rhythms of 38 prior players, reached for the final card fused to her sternum. The 39th refused to lift free. Instead, it burrowed inward, carving a shallow trench through pectoral muscle until it seated itself directly against the pericardium. The transparent window over her heart clouded for a moment, then cleared to reveal the card's blank surfaces now scrawled with her own looping signature, written in the fine crimson ink of her circulating blood. Pain arrived not as a wave but as architecture. Every bone in her body realigned itself along new axes. Vertebrae telescoped and fused. Ribs curved inward to form a second, smaller cage around the pulsing organ. Her pelvis cracked open like a clamshell, only to clamp shut again around a fresh knot of viscera that had no business existing inside human meat. Through it all, the cat thing, now fully shed of pretense, curled itself into the hollow between her new thoracic vault and the old one, a living gasket sealing the two architectures together. 200 words into this final suturing, the estate exhaled. Every window in the house shattered outward in perfect simultaneity. Glass teeth rained upward into the night sky before hanging there, suspended in defiance of gravity. Beyond the broken frames, the darkness had thickened to tar. It pressed inward, sliding over the sills in slow black tongues that tasted the air for the scent of fresh conversion. One tendril found the gap in Alice's chest and slipped inside, coiling around the 39th card like a lover's finger tracing a lover's name. She felt the card respond first as heat, then as cold, so absolute it burned. The sigils etched across her heart flared once, bright as surgical lamps, and began to migrate. They lifted from the transparent pane and drifted upward through the translucent meat of her sternum until they reached the underside of her skin. There they arranged themselves in a perfect 39-pointed star, whose center was her own open mouth. When she tried to scream, the sigils poured out instead, 39 black motes that spun in the air before her face, each one a condensed death, each one hungry. The creature wearing her features extended a limb part serpent, part surgical retractor, and plucked the first mote from the air. It pressed the mote against the tip of her tongue. The taste was memory made flesh, the copper flood of a throat slit from ear to ear, the bright snap of a femur driven upward through the groin, the slow wet unfolding of her abdomen laid open from pubis to xiphoid while the victim still breathed. Alice swallowed. The mote traveled downward, nesting beside her heart like a second, darker pacemaker. One by one, the creature fed her the rest. With each ingestion, her body grew heavier, denser, as though every death claimed added mass to her frame. Her skin stretched taut over new contours. Veins stood out in high relief, pulsing not red but the same obsidian black that once filled the cat's eyes. Between her legs, a new orifice bloomed, vertical, lipless, lined with the same membranous cardstock that had once been the deck. From its depths came a soft, rhythmic slapping, as of wet cards being shuffled by unseen hands. The creature withdrew to the far corner of the attic. Its many faces regarded her with something approaching tenderness. "You are the table now," it said, voices overlapping in choral mockery. "The dealer, the deck, the wager." Alice, no longer able to rise, no longer needing to open her arms. The black tendrils from outside flowed in earnest now, filling the room until only her glowing sigil, star, and the beating window of her heart remained visible. Somewhere deep within the new pelvic cavity, the final hand began to deal itself. cards sliding wetly against one another, each flip accompanied by the soft rupture of another internal membrane giving way. She felt the first card turn. It bore her face, smiling the wide, ecstatic rictus of the utterly damned, and beneath it in letters of fresh scar tissue the single word anti. The house shuddered once, a long orgasmic convulsion. Then the walls folded inward, meat meeting meat, until the entire structure became one continuous organ wrapped around the single radiant prize at its center. Alice Martinez, gambler no longer, now the eternal banker of 39 exquisite cruelties, waiting for the next desperate soul to sit at her table and lose everything that still pretended to be human. The table was no longer wood, nor attic floor, nor even flesh. It was Alice Martinez herself, her body flattened and stretched into a vast, quivering playing surface whose contours still remembered the shape of ribs and spine. The 39th card, now embedded so deeply that its blank face formed the exact center of her torso, pulsed once like a second slower heart. From that central wound radiated 38 radial scars, each one the healed over slot where a prior card had nested before migrating outward to claim new territory across her skin. Every scar wept a thin, clear ichor that smelled of burnt Merhad arterial copper. The black tendrils that had poured through the shattered windows now formed the rail around her edges, a living balustrade of fused meat and night. They quivered in anticipation, tasting the air for the scent of fresh desperation. Somewhere beyond the collapsed house, though house and night and Alice had long since ceased to be separate, the next player approached. She felt him before she saw him, a tremor in the dark, the quickened pulse of a man who had lost everything except the last coin of courage. He stepped through what had once been the attic door, now only a membranous curtain that parted for him with the wet sound of lips separating. Tall, gaunt eyes already glassy with the particular madness of late-stage gamblers, he carried nothing but the stink of cheap whiskey and older blood. When he looked down at the table that was Alice, recognition flickered, not of her face, but of the geometry of ruin he had come here to join. The creature that had once been cat, now a towering amalgam of serpent scale and borrowed features, coiled itself into the dealer's chair opposite the newcomer. Its crown of Alice faces smiled in welcome, teeth parting to reveal the glint of 39 mirrored pupils. "Sit," it said, and the word emerged from every pore of the table at once. The man obeyed. His knees struck the yielding surface of Alice's abdomen. She felt the pressure as intimate violation, every inch of contact mapping new nerves across what remained of her dignity. He reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed the central card. The touch ignited it. The 39th flared, projecting a perfect rectangle of light upward, a dealer's layout already half dealt, cards face down in a fan that trembled with their own breathing. 200 words into the new communion. The first card turned itself. It was not one of the original 39. This was something fresher, wetter, a living facsimile of the man's own palm. Fingerprints rendered in raised scar tissue, lifelines severed and restitched into a perfect circle. Beneath the print ran a single line in fresh blood. Your opening bet. The man laughed once, a dry, cracking sound, then reached beneath his coat and produced a small, stoppered vial. Inside floated a human eye, still trailing optic nerve like a pale worm. He uncorked it, the eye rolled upward to regard Alice's many-windowed heart. With a surgeon's delicacy, he plucked the organ free and set it upon the table, upon her sternum, directly above the embedded 39th. The moment it touched her skin, sensation exploded along every nerve still tethered to consciousness. She tasted the vitreous humor of his gaze, felt the slow grind of his optic nerve threading itself into her own visual pathways. Through his donated eye, she saw herself as he saw her, a cathedral of flayed meat, a banquet laid for something older than hunger. The creature dealer extended one scaled limb and flipped the next card. This one bore no image, only a perfect oval of transparency. Through it, the man could see straight into the hollow where Alice's womb had once been. Now it cradled a second. Miniature deck, 39 embryonic cards curled like fetuses in a sack of black fluid. Each tiny card already bore the faint outline of a future player's face. The man's own features flickered among them, half-formed, still soft as wet clay. He swallowed. "All in," he rasped. Alice felt the wager register as physical pressure. His entire remaining life compressed into a single, brutal systole that squeezed her heart until the sigils upon it flared white-hot. Blood his, hers, the houses sprang from every scar at once, painting the table in looping arabesques that spelled out the terms of forfeit. The eye upon her sternum blinked once, slowly then began to weep tears of mercury-bright fluid. The dealer's many mouths parted in unison. Call. The final card turned itself without being touched. It showed nothing but a mirror. In its surface, the man saw his own body already opened, ribs fanned like wings, heart lifted on a silver tray and offered upward to the waiting dark. Yet the reflection moved independently. It reached out, pressed its palm to the mirror's inner surface, and pushed. The glass of the card bulged outward, then shattered inward. Glass teeth buried themselves in the man's chest. He gasped once, a sound that became a gurgle as the mirror surface flooded with his own blood. Alice felt every shard as it lodged in him, felt the slow crawl of his life draining into her tabletop, feeding the embryonic deck that waited to be born. The creature leaned forward, tongue now a ribbon of living cardstock, lapping at the spreading pool. House wins! The man's body slumped across Alice's surface. His weight pressed her flat, then deeper, until she felt the last of his warmth seep into her own altered meat. The eye upon her sternum rolled once more, then stilled, pupil fixed forever on the empty chair. 39 became 40. The table Alice shuddered in long, ecstatic aftershocks. Somewhere in the black beyond the broken house, another heartbeat quickened, drawn toward the scent of fresh loss. The dealer waited, patient, as the grave she had long since outgrown, for the next hand to begin. The new player's body had not yet cooled when the table, that vast, breathing expanse of Alice Martinez, began to digest him. His skin softened first, then liquefied in slow, deliberate patches, the way candle wax surrenders to flame. Muscle followed, peeling away in translucent sheets that draped themselves across her scars, like fresh bandages. Bone came last, cracking softly as it was drawn inward through the radial wounds, each fragment finding a new home among the lattice of her altered skeleton. The eye he had wagered still rested upon her sternum, pupil dilated in permanent surprise, now ringed with a corona of his own drying vitreous humor. 40 cards now resided within her. The original 39 had multiplied by annexation. Every death claimed added one more facet to the deck, one more window through which the house could peer outward and hunger inward. The 39th, still the keystone at her center, throbbed with borrowed vitality. Its blank face now faintly etched with the newcomer's final expression, mouth open in a silent scream that had never quite escaped his throat. The creature dealer uncoiled from the empty chair and flowed across the table's surface, scales rasping against the yielding meat of Alice's abdomen. It paused above the still, weeping eye and lowered its crown of faces until one mouth, wearing her own features from before the first card turned, kissed the cornea. The kiss was not gentle. Tongue of living pasteboard extended, barbed and deliberate, and punctured the sclera. Fluid jetted upward in a thin arc. The creature drank, throat working in peristaltic waves, until the donated eye collapsed inward like a punctured balloon. 200 words deeper into the feast, the house remembered how to breathe again. Walls that had folded inward now unfurled in slow, luxurious stretches, reforming rooms that had never existed before, corridors lined with rib-like arches, chambers whose floors were shallow pools of mingled blood. Ceilings hung with glistening stalactites of tendon and nerve. Through every new aperture the night outside pressed closer, blacker, thicker, until sky and house were indistinguishable, one continuous organ pulsing under starless dark. Alice felt the change register as pressure behind her multiplied eyes. Vision no longer belonged to sockets alone. It streamed in through every scar, every embedded card, every weeping pore. She saw the estate from angles that should have been impossible, from beneath the floorboards where pale tendrils still quested, from the rafters where dried husks of previous players hung like forgotten laundry, from the broken windows where glass teeth still dripped mercury tears. Most terrible of all, she saw herself as the table saw her, an endless plain of flayed topography, cities of scar tissue rising where ribs once stood, rivers of ichor carving canyons down her flanks, the central wound a caldera from which fresh cards continually birthed themselves in wet. Slippery convulsions. The dealer lifted its head. Silver fluid, stolen vitreous, dripped from its many chins. Another comes, it said, the words vibrating through every layer of her meat until they emerged from her own mouth in chorus. The scent of debt is strong tonight. She tried to protest, to refuse the next hand, but protest required a throat that still remembered how to close. Instead, her new pelvic orifice, the lipless mouth lined with shuffling cards, opened wider. A soft, wet slap echoed as the deck within her dealt itself another card without permission. It emerged slick and steaming, face already turned upward. A perfect miniature of the approaching player, features not yet fully formed, but already marked with the same glassy desperation. The creature flowed back to the dealer's position. Its body stretched thinner, taller, until it resembled a croupier carved from midnight itself. One scaled hand reached down and stroked the length of Alice's sternum, fingers tracing the 39th card's edges until they drew fresh beads of blood. The touch was almost tender. "Be patient," it whispered, and the whisper traveled the length of every nerve still tethered to what had once been her mind. "The game does not end. It only grows new players beyond the membranous curtain that had once been a door. Footsteps sounded heavy, hesitant, the tread of someone who had already lost the argument with himself. The black tendrils of the house rose to greet him, tasting his sweat, his fear, the copper promise beneath his skin. Alice felt the table that was her quiver in anticipation. Her heart, visible through its transparent pain, beat once, twice, in perfect synchrony with the approaching pulse. The curtain parted. Another face appeared in the doorway, younger this time, eyes already searching for the glint of impossible luck. The dealer smiled with every mouth at once. "Welcome," it said, and the word was written in fresh blood across Alice's skin. "Place your bet." The house leaned closer, walls bending inward like closing jaws, and waited for the next exquisite cruelty to begin. The newcomer paused at the threshold, boots sinking into the shallow pool that had once been floorboards and was now the shallow basin of Alice Martinez's pooled essence. He was younger than the last, barely past the age when men still believe luck can be bargained with rather than stolen. His coat hung heavy with rain that had never fallen outside these walls. Droplets slid down leather and dripped onto her surface, each one registering as a tiny, intimate kiss against the stretched plane of her abdomen. He carried no vial, no trophy of prior loss. Only a single tarnished coin, edges worn smooth by generations of thumbs that had rubbed it for fortune. He flipped it once heads, always heads, and let it fall onto the table that was her sternum. The coin struck the transparent window over her heart and stuck there, embedded halfway through the pericardium, like a silver nail driven into living wood. Through the new puncture, she felt the cold metal kiss the beating muscle directly. Every subsequent pulse rang it like a bell, a low metallic toll that vibrated outward through every scar and card window until the entire house hummed in sympathetic mourning. The dealer, its form now so elongated it brushed the reformed rafters, leaned forward on limbs that ended in delicate, many-knuckled fingers. One of those fingers traced the coin's edge where it pierced her. A thin thread of mercury-bright fluid leaked from the wound and ran down the curve of her ribs to pool in the hollow of her navel, now a shallow crater ringed with embryonic cards, still curled in their sack. "Small stakes," the young man said, voice cracking on the last syllable. "But it's all I have left." The creature's crown of faces, some still recognizably Alice's, others borrowed from the digested, tilted in unison. Small stakes make the sweetest bleed. 200 words deeper, into the hand. The deck within her pelvic cavity stirred. The lipless mouth between her thighs parted wider. Wet slaps echoed as cards shuffled themselves in the dark, amniotic dark. One emerged, slick and steaming, and slid upward along the inner curve of her thigh until it rested face, down upon the table's surface upon the stretched skin just above her pubic ridge. The young man reached for it. His fingers brushed her flesh and recoiled as though burned. The contact had seared no mark on him, but on her it left a perfect handprint of blistered tissue, the whorls of his fingerprints raised in fresh scar. He turned the card anyway. It bore no face, no suit, only a perfect oval mirror, smaller than the last, its surface rippling like disturbed water. When he looked into it, he saw not his reflection but hers, Alice as she had been before the first deal, clothed, whole, sitting at a neon-lit table in some forgotten casino, eyes bright with the gambler's fever. The mirrored Alice smiled at him, lips parting to reveal teeth filed to needlepoints. Then the reflection reached forward, palm pressing against the inner surface of the oval, and pushed. The mirror bulged outward, glass stretched like skin over a fist. Then it tore. Shards drove inward, not into him but into her. They lodged in the meat around her navel, each fragment a tiny window, now showing fragments of that earlier life. Cigarette smoke curling around her fingers, the clink of chips, the bartender's knowing smirk as he poured another double. Every shard carried sensation with it, phantom heat, phantom laughter, phantom hope, and Alice felt them all at once, a sudden flood of what she had been before the 39th card fused to her sternum. The contrast was unbearable, ruin tasted sharper when seasoned with memory. The young man staggered back a step. His hand went to his chest where no wound showed, yet blood darkened his shirt in a perfect oval matching the card's shape. What the hell? The dealer extended a single finger and tapped the embedded coin. It rang again louder. The young man's knees buckled. He dropped forward, palms slapping wetly against Alice's ribs. Through the contact, she tasted his pulse fast, erratic, already thinning. "Call," the creature said, voice layered with every throat it had ever borrowed. Another card turned itself, rising from between her legs like a tongue unfurling. This one showed his own face. Not as he was now, but as he would be in 30 seconds, eyes rolled back, mouth stretched in ecstatic rictus, throat slit from ear to ear by an invisible blade. Beneath the image, in letters of fresh blister, all in, he tried to stand. His legs refused. Instead, they folded beneath him until he knelt fully upon her, weight pressing down through skin, and scar until she felt the delicate snap of small bones in his feet giving way. Blood welled from his soles, running in thin rivers to feed the radial scars that spread outward from her center. Alice no longer able to scream, only to feel convulsed once. The table shuddered, walls flexed inward, then outward in long, luxurious peristalsis. The coin in her heart rang a final time, clear and terrible. The dealer leaned close, its many mouths opened in sequence, exhaling the scent of old myrrh and fresh copper. House calls, the mirrored card shattered inward for the last time. Glass teeth buried themselves in the young man's throat. Arterial spray painted her surface in high, looping arcs that spelled out the next name on the growing roster of the damned. His body slumped forward, cheek pressed to the transparent window over her heart. Through his dying eyes, she saw her own organ beat one last time in perfect synchrony with his fading rhythm. 40 became 41. The house sighed, a long, sated exhalation that rippled through every corridor of meat and memory. The dealer straightened, scales gleaming with stolen blood. Another heartbeat already quickened in the dark beyond the membranous curtain. Alice waited, table, deck, banker, victim, while the next desperate hand began to deal itself inside the warm, wet cathedral of her ruin. The membranous curtain parted for the third time that endless night, admitting a woman whose silhouette carried the particular weariness of someone who had already lost the argument with fate, but refused to leave the table. She was older than the last two mid-40s, perhaps, hair cropped short and streaked with premature silver, eyes the color of old bruises. In her left hand she clutched a small, cracked photograph. In her right, nothing at all. The photograph trembled as she stepped fully onto the living expanse of Alice Martinez. She did not flinch at the sight of the table that breathed. Instead, she knelt slow, deliberate, and pressed the photograph face down against the transparent pane over Alice's heart. The coin from the previous player still protruded there like a silver tumor. The woman's fingers brushed it and came away smeared with mercury-bright fluid. Through the contact, Alice tasted memory. A child's laughter echoing down a hallway that no longer existed. The soft click of a lock turning for the last time. The slow seep of hospital disinfectant over tile. The dealer, its serpentine length now draped across rafters like wet laundry, lowered its crown until one borrowed face hovered inches above the newcomer's own. No coin, no eye, only paper and grief. Interesting, the woman met its multiplied gaze without blinking. I know what this place does. I came to end it. A ripple passed through the house, walls flexing inward, then out, as though the entire structure laughed without sound. 200 words into the wager, the deck within Alice's pelvic cavity convulsed. The lipless mouth opened wider than anatomy permitted. A single card emerged, riding a slow tide of black amniotic fluid. It slid upward between her thighs across the stretched plane of her abdomen and stopped directly beneath the photograph. Face down, the woman lifted her hand. The photograph adhered to the card, as though magnetized. When she turned it over, the image on the card was no longer her child. It was her child as the house remembered children, small limbs unfolded like wet wings, torso opened in a perfect Y incision, tiny heart lifted on a silver tray identical to the one that had claimed the previous player's reflection. She did not scream. Instead, she reached forward and placed both palms flat against the card. Skin met living pasteboard. Sensation detonated along Alice's nerves in sympathetic fire. Through 41 windows, she felt the woman's pulse hammer against her own scar. Tissue surface fast, furious, refusing to break rhythm even as fresh blood welled between their joined hands. The dealer extended one barbed tongue and licked the edge of the photograph where it fused to the card. Your bet is already placed. You wagered memory the moment you crossed the threshold. Another card rose unbidden from between Alice's legs. This one bore no mirror, no face, only a perfect black oval, deeper than absence. The woman stared into it and saw nothing at first. Then shapes resolved, herself, years younger, sitting at a different table in a different city, dealing cards with steady hands while a small boy watched from the doorway. The memory played forward in merciless detail. The night she taught him poker to keep him quiet while she chased one more hand. The morning she left him sleeping to chase another. The afternoon the hospital called because he had waited too long for her to come home. The oval drank the memory. Light bled from the woman's eyes, not tears, but something brighter. Purer stolen luminance that streamed downward into the black disk until her irises dulled to matte grey. She swayed but did not fall. Alice felt the theft register as physical weight. Another facet added to the deck inside her, another window opening in the cathedral of her ruin. The sigils on her heart shifted again, rearranging themselves into new constellations that spelled the woman's name in looping scar script. The dealer leaned closer. Call, the black oval card pulsed once. Then it inverted, not turned, but inverted as though reality itself folded inside out around its edges. The woman's body jerked, her spine arched backward until vertebrae cracked in neat succession. Skin split along the midline from pubic bone to throat, not violently, but with the patient precision of a surgeon who has done this 1,000 times. Muscle parted. Ribs fanned outward in slow, ecstatic bloom. Between them, where heart and lungs should have been, lay only a perfect negative space, a void shaped exactly like the child in the photograph. From that void rose a soft, wet sound, a heartbeat not her own. The woman's mouth opened in a final, soundless gasp. The void inside her chest answered with a child's laughter, high, delighted, impossibly distant. 41 became 42, her body slumped forward across Alice's surface, arms outstretched as though reaching for something that had already slipped away. The photograph card fused flush against the transparent pane over Alice's heart. Through it the stolen child's face now smiled up at her, small fingers pressed to the inner surface of the window like a visitor at an aquarium. The house exhaled, a long luxurious breath that carried the scent of hospital linen and baby shampoo. The dealer uncoiled to its full height, scales gleaming with reflected grief. Another heartbeat already trembled in the dark beyond the curtain, quicker this time, younger, hungrier. Alice waited. Table, and deck, and banker, and grave, while the next hand dealt itself in the warm, wet dark of her ever-expanding ruin. The final heartbeat crossed the threshold without footsteps. No silhouette preceded it, no scent of whiskey or grief or silver coins, only silence so absolute it pressed against the breathing walls like a second skin. The membranous curtain did not part, it simply thinned until nothing separated inside from out. Then the player was there, featureless at first, a vacancy wearing the vague outline of a human form. As it drew nearer, details bled in, pale skin stretched too tight over unfamiliar bones, eyes that reflected nothing, mouth a thin seam that had never learned to smile or scream. It carried no wager visible to ordinary sight. Yet Alice felt the weight of it immediately, a debt so old it had calcified into architecture, older than the house, older than the 39 cards that had started this long supper. It settled onto what had once been her pelvic cradle, straddling the lipless mouth that still dealt cards in soft, wet slaps. The contact was not flesh against flesh. It was absence pressing against presence, hunger meeting banquet. Through every scar, window Alice saw the newcomer for what it was. Not a gambler at all, but the original dealer before dealers wore scales and borrowed faces. The thing that had first inscribed the rules in blood and pasteboard, then stepped back to watch the game eat itself generation after generation. The creature that had worn the cat S-shape. Now a vast, looping scaffold of serpent and stolen features, coiled tighter around the rafters. Its many mouths opened in perfect unison, yet produced no sound. Only a slow exhalation that smelled of libraries burning underwater. 200 words into the terminal hand, the deck within Alice convulsed one final time. The pelvic orifice yawned to its widest limit, muscle tore in neat radial lines as the last card birthed itself. Not slick with fluid, but dry as old bone, edges sharp enough to split light. It rose unaided, turned itself in midair, and settled face, up upon the transparent pane over her heart. No mirror, no oval of absence, no stolen face or memory, only the number 1 etched in the same looping scar. Script that branded every sigil on her ruined organ. Beneath it, in letters of fresh, slow, weeping blood. I have waited long enough. The house understood before Alice did. Walls folded inward, not in peristalsis this time, but in collapse. Corridors of meat shortened, chambers imploded, every reformed room rushing toward the center like lungs exhaling their final breath. The radial scars across her surface ignited, each one flaring white before burning black, charring inward until only the keystone card, the 39th, now the first, remained untouched at her core. The original dealer reached forward. Its hand was not hand, but the negative space where a hand should have been, fingers of nothing closed around the embedded card. When it pulled, there was no resistance. The 39th lifted free with the soft sucking sound of a heart plucked from its pericardial sac. Blood fountained upward in a single perfect column, then froze midair. Crimson stalactites hanging above the table that had once been Alice Martinez. Through the vacancy where her heart had been, she saw everything at once. Every player who had sat at her surface, every wager claimed, every death folded into the next. The memories streamed outward like smoke, drawn toward the featureless figure, until they nested inside its hollow chest. One by one the windows in her flesh clouded over, then darkened, then sealed. Scars smoothed, limbs retracted. The vast playing surface that was her body began to fold in upon itself, ribs closing like petals at dusk, pelvis knitting shut, skin regrowing over raw meat in translucent sheets. The dealer held the single card, now the only card, between thumb and forefinger of absence. It regarded the shrinking form at the center of the collapsing house. One last ante, it said, and the voice was every voice that had ever begged for one more hand. Alice, reduced now to something small, almost human again, lifted what remained of her face. Through eyes that had returned to ordinary brown, she met its gaze. She did not speak. There was nothing left to wager. Instead, she reached up with 7 jointed fingers that had begun to simplify back toward 5. She closed them around the card. The instant of contact was not pain, nor ecstasy, nor revelation. It was recognition. The house finished collapsing around them. Walls met ceiling, met floor in a single, wet embrace until nothing remained but a smooth black sphere no larger than a human heart. Inside it, 2 figures sat at a table that no longer needed legs. One held no cards, the other held one. The dealer smiled, finally properly with a mouth that had waited centuries to do so. Your deal. Alice Martinez shuffled the single card between her restored fingers. The highly refined surface texture caught no light because no light remained, yet she felt the familiar rasp of pasteboard against skin, the old gambler sitch returning like breath after drowning. She dealt face down. Then she turned it over. The card was blank. She looked across the table at the thing that had waited so long. It nodded once. House always wins. The black sphere contracted a final time. Tight enough to crush bone, soft enough to cradle memory, and went still, outside wherever outside had gone. Nothing moved, nothing waited, nothing dealt. Only silence. Perfect and absolute, holding 30. 9 cruelties and 1 last gambler in the dark between hands.